Hello and welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave.
And tonight we are going to be having a discussion about epistemic responsibility. So this came about because a few days ago in our debate group, I asked a question about if we had a moral obligation to get vaccinated. One response I got was that we had an epistemic responsibility. Whilst I've glazed the surface of epistemology, I've looked into various theories of knowledge and understand epistemic justification, aka the burden of proof. I'd not heard this term before, so of course I did what I always do in this sort of situation. I Google and send Dave a message and see if I can get the basics of it by the time he responds to me. As it happens, the way it was being used is similar to a moral obligation, but not quite. And actually, there was a hell of a lot more to epistemic responsibility than I had time to actually read up on. After our stream with Ozzy the other day, hopefully you saw that, we touched on epistemic justification a few times, and Dave and I thought actually it would be a really good idea to cover off this topic in more detail. So, first I guess we should cover off the basics, eh, Dave?
Yeah, that sounds like a good place to start.
Yeah, so what is epistemology?
Epistemology is the study of knowledge. So it's looking at various theories of knowledge. What is knowledge? What it means to have knowledge? What a belief is? Justification of beliefs, that kind of thing.
Does it also cover things like truth and all that sort of stuff in it as well?
It does.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Sorry, Karen.
I was just going to say anything that you would consider around knowledge, beliefs, how we see the world. That's kind of covered by epistemology.
Yeah, cool. So we could almost say that science would be an extension of epistemology then.
It is. It would be methodological naturalism.
Ah, wicked.
Well, kind of based on it.
Yeah. So basically, science is philosophy.
Yeah. It's evolved beyond it now, but yeah.
Awesome.
You're just trolling people.
I am. I couldn't even keep a straight face. So, what exactly do we mean by epistemic responsibility then?
Okay, it's a concept. It's not just that particular thing, but a concept that involves various different things. So if we begin with the basics, which would be a form of epistemic duty, where it's our duty to learn as many true things as possible and to ensure that our epistemological foundations lead towards truth.
Okay.
Now, somebody could argue here that duties and values and things like that, they're all subjective. So there's no objective grounding for this kind of epistemological duty. But if you're going to argue, like you've heard Matt Dillahunty say things like, I want to know as many or believe as many true things as possible and as few false things as possible.
Mm-hmm.
That will create that epistemic duty.
Right.
And same if you're a skeptic, at least in the sense of how most people in the atheist community use skeptic, which is more kind of general doubt. If you're going to be skeptical, there has to be a purpose behind being skeptical.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not just, well, I just want to doubt as many things as possible.
Because that would go into denialism, wouldn't it?
It would. So there has to be a purpose for the skepticism, and that most people would say, I want to believe as little bullshit as possible.
Yeah. And I think that's a worthy cause, but this creates that duty to, as you say, to learn as many true things. So that's the grounding of epistemic responsibility.
It is, and then that would move us on to the idea of blameworthiness and praiseworthiness.
Right.
So, if you were to accept this epistemic duty by not holding on to an epistemology or epistemological stance that allows you to learn these things, if you take on the stance where you can learn a lot of false things, and because these false things make you feel comfortable, you haven't discharged that epistemological duty.
Yeah, as Ozzy's just chimed in and said, one way to summarize what you said about doubt is Wittgenstein's dictum: one needs grounds for doubt.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Ozzy.
Nice to see you, Ozzy. And hey,
Oh,
Jack, by the
hi.
way, and anyone else
And
that's
hello,
tuned in.
Josh. Yeah, so we have this kind of duty, and if we don't discharge it properly, we can accept blame or fault or um so the idea then is to kind of ground yourself in the sort of epistemology that leads towards discharging that duty,
Mhm.
and leads towards the discovery of truth.
Do you have to cover off what truth is at this point to really get under the skin of it, or can you just do with a basic correspondence theory or something
I
like that?
suppose you could, but for the purpose of this, just go with something like correspondence theory. When most skeptics in the atheist community talk about truth, they're generally talking about something like the correspondence theory.
Yeah,
They want to
cool.
believe as many true statements as possible.
And if you're not sure what that is, that is what is in accordance with reality, basically.
Yeah, basically, it's propositions, and you want to believe the right propositions. The propositions must match some aspect of reality.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, bringing it back to what happened in our debate group the other day, how is epistemic responsibility similar to a moral obligation?
I suppose you could consider it a form of virtue.
Right?
So, if you want to be virtuous, being epistemically responsible is a form of virtue. So, therefore, there's also the grounds of, like I said, blameworthiness and praiseworthiness. With a moral obligation, you've got that your actions and your knowledge of the outcome can affect whether you are moral or immoral or responsible.
Yeah, fair. Actually, Ozzy's just chimed in with a question. Seeing as we're in between sections, I'll field it now. He says, "Are there any beliefs or claims or propositions which do not require justification or warrant?"
Ooh, I actually don't know that one. Ozzy is the better man for that.
All right, I'm gonna take a stab at it as a layperson. I think that at least inwardly to yourself, everything requires some level of justification. But if it's a really, really tiny claim, like I feel that this bridge is safe for me to cross, you don't need a massive amount of justification. You can go, well, based on induction, I've gone over this bridge before. I can see other cars going over it. And I feel that that is a small justification. That's all that's really required. You know what bridges are designed for, you know what their purpose is. But I think everything needs some form of justification to be rational. But there are certain things that you could say are completely irrational as well, aren't they? Like if you just like the taste of something, and then they don't need a justification. It was just I put it in my mouth and I liked it.
Yeah, I mean, you could go with something like a properly basic belief. You look outside and it's raining, therefore you believe it's raining.
Yeah, but then
Or
the
I
justification is your
exist.
senses. Is your justification then your senses? But then are your senses enough justification? For something small like rain, I'd say probably yeah. I suppose it depends on how deep you want to make that justification, doesn't it?
I would think so. I mean, Ozzy is far more informed than I am about these things.
Josh actually just chimed in with, what about subjective preferences? And that's basically one of the things that I was just saying about chocolate. If you like the taste of chocolate, that doesn't necessarily really warrant any real justification other than, well, I put it in my mouth and it tasted good, so I like the taste. That's more of an irrational belief than something that requires any more justification than that. Are there any other subjective preferences that you could think about needing more? So, what sort of subjective preference does need a greater justification? I don't think it really does. I mean, people just like what they like, don't they? If you listen to music,
I like eating babies for Sunday roast. That probably needs some justification.
It might need a justification on why it should be allowed, but I mean, if you just like the taste of babies, then surely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm stuck on eating babies now.
I'm sorry. So am I.
So
They're
we
pretty
atheists
tasty.
do. But only on Sunday mornings, as Josh says.
Yeah. Got to get the blasphemy in there somehow.
So, back to where we were. So, justification is a part of epistemic responsibility.
It is. You need to be able to justify why you believe something. Not necessarily to anybody else, but if you want to claim that your beliefs are rational and good and you're attempting to, you're aiming at truth, then you should be able to justify why that belief is rational, why it's most probably true, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, fair. So, what sort of things count as justification?
Arguments, evidence, good reasons, at least. When you say something like evidence on its own isn't like I could hold you up a rock from the moon, but until I tell you it's a rock from the moon and I tell you how I got it and all that, it's not evidence of anything except me holding some kind of rock-like material in my hand. So evidence comes with reasons and justifications for why it's evidence and why it's good evidence.
So, evidence is basically indicative, but it needs to be translated through humans, I guess.
Through theories and justifications, yeah.
Fair. And you also mentioned good reasons. So, give us an example of, say, a good and bad reason to believe something.
I went outside today and I came home dry, so therefore it must have been raining. Yeah?
Yeah.
I look out my window and I can see water falling from the sky. That's a good reason to believe it's raining.
Yeah.
Or you could go a slightly more theoretical route, like remember when we were discussing testimony, and I talked about how your wife or husband or whoever tells you that they were late because they were stuck in a traffic jam. Them being your wife or husband and being trustworthy and you know them, that gives you good reason to accept that what they say is true.
Yeah, definitely. If they're the sort of person that you know tends not to lie, and you trust them, you love them, etc., that's generally enough reason. And I suppose you could also say they know full well that I can check that road. So if they are lying and I check on it, I'm going to catch them out in a lie. So it's actually quite a risky lie for really, really small gain.
Yeah. So it's basically just rational enough reasons, good enough reasons.
Yeah, that's fair. So if we went to a bad, catch you later, Ozzy. Have yourself a good dinner.
Take care, Ozzy.
So if we had, say, a more bad reason, it would be something along the lines of my friend said or my dad said, and that's the only reason you believe it. They're not. if your dad made some claim about anything, but he wasn't a professional in that field or anything like that, it sounded more like a standard cliche or something like that. You could argue that that would be a bad reason to believe it. Maybe as a child, it's a good enough reason because you accept what your parents say, and children aren't the most rational creatures anyway, so it's good enough justification for a child to trust their dad to say, don't cross that road or whatever it is. But as an adult, if your dad has told you not to cross that road and you haven't been given any reasoning and you go, oh yeah, I just don't cross it because my dad said not to. Well, why?
Yeah. Yeah. Or something like, my pastor said atheists have no morals, so therefore I believe atheists have no morals.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And because there's good rational defeaters for that statement. And this brings us on to the sort of next part of epistemic responsibility, which is having an open mind and accepting that you could be wrong. So when you're confronted with an opposing view to that claim, you should be open to listening to it. So in the case of the pastor saying atheists have no morals and the believer accepting that, if they come across an atheist who has morals, that should be a rational defeater for it. If they have an open mind, they will accept that that shows that their pastor was telling porkies, basically.
Yeah. I suppose it depends on how they view morality as well. If the only way they view morality is following God's commandments, and even though an atheist is doing things that are technically moral, they're not doing it under God, they could say, well, it's not real morality because they're not following God.
But again, they could take the time to look up morality proper.
Yeah.
And learn that that isn't all there is to morality.
No, of course. Yeah, preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
Trying to
So,
think about their side.
yeah. So part of accepting epistemic responsibility is having an open mind, being open to counter arguments. Now, we're going to get people here who say, well, you shouldn't have such an open mind that your brain falls out. That's quite a popular statement. Do you know what I mean? But what's being said here isn't that we should accept every statement without question until we have a rational defeater for it. It's that if we hold a belief or we claim to know something and we come across somebody who says, well, hang on a minute, that's not quite right, we should be open to listening to what they say and giving our own counter arguments for that. But always accepting that we could be wrong.
Yes, I think that's an important part of skepticism as a whole, though, isn't it? The ability to turn it inwards, to look at yourself, and every time someone presents a contrary claim, actually go, right, why do you think that? Da, 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 and find out exactly why, and then you can have that conversation and find out if they are justified in believing what they do and having that conversation, and maybe reassessing your own values as well. And I think what it can be what a lot of us are guilty of if you're speaking with your millionth YEC of the day. You can be like, oh, this again. And you do shut down and you just go, oh, well, it's just a standard YEC claim. They're going to be, denying all science, da 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 da. But I suppose if we were being a good skeptic in that part, we would listen to each individual YEC and try and have that conversation with them. But perhaps learn a few warning signs and go, right, this conversation isn't going to go anywhere. There's no point in me having it at all.
Yeah, exactly. If there's a script that they're always following and you have come across those same counter arguments a million times before, hearing them again isn't going to do anything. But consider, how many times have we had a discussion with another atheist who said, I don't hold beliefs? And when you try and explain what beliefs are, they turn around to you and go, no, that's not what a belief is.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, a belief is something you hold true without evidence. Well, no, that's not what a belief is. That is a definition of a belief that has become popularized by the atheist community to try and discredit religious beliefs.
Exactly. So if they're accepting this epistemic responsibility as a skeptic, they should be willing to listen to you, especially when they're presented with evidence that what they think is a belief isn't actually a belief. They've come across this opinion by echo chambers and a need to feel superior and a need to feel like they've distanced themselves completely from religion. Anything religious related must be irrational by default.
Mm. Yeah, no. You even see a number of claims that come up that, just being an atheist makes you rational and smarter and more intelligent. And the irony being that's quite an irrational belief to hold, because just believing in God or disbelieving in God or suspending judgment in God does not make you default rational in any way. What Dave has already explained tonight is your reasons for believing it, the evidence for or against that belief. So, with a YEC, so Young Earth Creationist, they could potentially be rational in their young Earth creationist belief if they have been potentially homeschooled, kept in an environment where they haven't had access to the internet, they haven't been allowed access to decent science. All they have is the information that they've been given, and they can't find out any more. They would be, at that point, rational in their belief that the world is only 6,000 years. But as soon as they found out about all these various dating methods, and if they then just rejected them, going, oh, science is the devil's work, or something like that, all of a sudden that belief becomes an irrational one, because they're not rejecting it for good reasons. And in fact, this might sound a little bit like an ad populum, but most Christians even accept the age of the earth, don't they?
They do.
And I think pretty much every scientist, except for a creationist scientist, would also talk about these various dating methods. So therefore, as soon as this person is presented all of this credible evidence against their belief, if they maintain that belief, it's no longer justified, it's no longer rational. But you can also understand how that turns their entire world upside down. They've believed this thing for so long, and it's a big part of their identity. So they are going to be resistant to this information. So you almost have to broach the subject more carefully than you see everyone do online, myself included. I can be a right cock at times.
Everybody can,
Yeah.
apart from Ozzy.
I try really hard not to be, but sometimes.
Only human. But I mean, you could also argue, have those young Earth creationists accepted any form of epistemic responsibility?
That's a good question. I suppose.
I mean, if their argument is that they're trying to discover the truth of God,
Yeah.
and say they're aiming to figure out the truth of God's creation, then they shouldn't be dogmatic about something like that. They should just go, well, maybe I've been wrong about what the Bible says. It doesn't necessarily, by saying that, they're not necessarily saying the Bible is wrong, just the interpretation. So they should be open to accepting these differences.
Yeah, I mean there are people that will talk about the creation story being more metaphorical, more poetry,
A
uh,
poem, yeah.
yeah, than an actual story. It's just describing, you know, oh, it's a metaphor for it all, yeah. Um, and actually, if you do read the creation story, there are sort of hints through certain interpretations at evolution and things like that as well. It depends how you read it. So it's hard because they've had it hammered into them that the Bible is the truth, it's the exact word of God, it's a literal book of everything that happened, how it happened, when it happened. So it's starting top down, though, isn't it? It's starting with the conclusion, and therefore going, well, everything that agrees with this is true, rather than going, what is true about this? How could I interpret this so it's actually in alignment with reality? Is there a good interpretation of the Bible that does at least fit somewhat with things? Yeah, so I think you're right there. They're probably not fulfilling their epistemic responsibility because they do say they want to know the truth, but they want the truth to be what they think it's going to be.
Yeah. But I think that's generally a human trait.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about when you have a discussion with other atheists about what belief is, what knowledge is, or even just what the term atheism is.
Not
Um,
that one again.
no, I'm not going to be arguing that. But if you think about how hard some of them cling on to that anchoring bias that they have, it's what they learned first, and it's what they've been saying, so therefore it must be correct. Everybody else is saying it.
Yeah.
So I think that's just generally a human trait, and accepting the epistemological responsibility of something like skepticism
Mm-hmm.
can help overcome that. But you have to be more than just an aesthetic skeptic, where you're just giving across the appearance of being skeptical. You have to actually accept this responsibility and discharge this duty.
Josh says epistemic inertia.
That's quite a good word.
Yeah. I don't know if that's a real thing in philosophy, but it damn well should be.
It should be. Yep.
Josh,
Wanting
write your
to know the
paper.
truth, eh?
Josh needs to write a paper on it.
It does. Well,
Submit it to
wanting to
SEP.
know the truth can lead to you wanting to learn more truth and more truth and more truth. So there is an inertia behind it.
Yeah, definitely. But I think that you also need to be willing to let go of your ego and your pride and admit that you were wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most difficult things. I mean, I suffer it too. Especially when I first started university, it's like, oh, I was wrong. What?
I think that's natural as well, isn't it? It can be hard to get over yourself.
Yeah.
And it is ourselves that get in the way of ourselves more than anyone else does, really, especially with stuff like this.
Yeah. And it becomes easier. The more you do it, the
Mm.
easier it becomes. The more you realized how wrong you were about so many things, the more open you are to understanding how wrong you are.
Yeah, Josh says it's just as hard to change directions as to get it started.
It is.
Yeah,
I agree.
and it is. Yeah, I mean, one of my first articles I wrote on Answers in Reason was how I'd briefly got taken in by the anti-vax movement. I'd seen a lot of articles and there was a lot of conspiracy stuff going on, but it was all written in a way that seemed quite valid. And I suppose I was quite new to the conspiracy side of things like that as well. And I had someone that I trusted talking about it, and they convinced me to not get my son vaccinated at the time. Now, this was only delayed by a few weeks because they started contradicting themselves in stories and changing their stories. And when I started questioning them on it, it was always, well, my friend said, oh, well, I don't really understand it. You'll have to speak to my friend. They understand it. And I was like, hang on. You don't really understand this thing, but you're doing it. And I looked into it more and more and found out that it was a bit of... So I started presenting the other side to it and all the actual science rather than the pseudoscience, rather than the people that were trying to sell you something. And that's one of the key things I noticed. All the anti-vax sites out there seem to be trying to sell you something, some form of oil or rub or acupuncture or crystal healing or anything like that. And it was just like, right. And I started reading more and more stories about some people who had been taken in by all of this stuff and ended up dying and etc. And I did a 180 on it, but in trying to speak to them about it, they couldn't admit that they were wrong. And I see them all the time. In fact, going on and on and on about this stuff on the internet, and they're not open to reason. They're caught up in the conspiracy. And I think there's some of it is pride, not being able to admit that you're wrong. Also, when you've held a belief for so long and you've been telling so many people this is what it is, even if you no longer believe it, it's kind of hard to go back and go, right, all of you people that I told you not to vaccinate your kids. Shit, sorry.
Yeah.
Vaccinated. So they're almost stuck. It's a bit of a sunk cost.
It is. And it also brings us to another part of epistemic responsibility in quite a nice way. If you think about how we disseminate information, how we spread information to other people,
Mm-hmm.
if we are epistemically responsible and we make sure that what we know is probably true, the things that we believe are most probably true, the things that we claim to know, we have good justification for claiming to know, and that they're true, then when we speak to other people, we won't be disseminating false information.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll be being responsible within our community. Like, we won't be spreading false information about vaccines. We won't be causing measles outbreaks. So another part of epistemic responsibility is how we transmit information to others. If we're responsible with our own information, we'll be responsible with the information that we share with other people.
Yeah. And I guess don't do it by meme.
Yeah. I mean, memes are effective. Did you watch this season of The Boys?
Yes. Yeah. That was.
It was very good. And they talk about memes in an excellent way, how well they work for spreading information.
Yeah.
So if you're responsible with your memes, they're a good way of spreading information and correct information. The problem is they're not generally used for that.
No, they're generally used in a dismissive way, or look at you way, or making fun of someone or their beliefs or something like that.
And as they say, a lie travels faster than the truth.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I suppose the other side of it is memes tend to be quite simple, and I suppose a good lie is quite simple, but the truth is very rarely that simple.
It's usually complicated, yeah.
Exactly. So the truth probably wouldn't fit on a meme.
No.
Unless it's saying, y'all need some philosophy.
Everybody needs some philosophy. And I mean, this brings us to another thing that gets said in the atheist community a lot. Philosophy is dead. Nobody needs philosophy, blah, 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 blah. Well, all of this is philosophy. Understanding epistemic responsibility, understanding what epistemology is, it's all philosophy. So it's important for atheists to actually learn this stuff.
Yeah, it is. Especially, I find it quite funny at times because as atheists, we often get really annoyed by religious folks for ignoring science. I mean, not all of them. We're talking specifically about generally YECs and things like that. Why are you having a conversation about evolution without actually learning the real information on evolution? Why are you just looking at your creationist sites? Yet we have these conversations about beliefs and knowledge and all that sort of stuff. Yet we only look at the atheist sites and the atheist dogma on these topics. The burden of proof is only on the person that making a claim, etc. We don't actually spend the time looking into the area we're doing, which is philosophy. So it's almost special pleading in a way, isn't it? We're making creationists use the science for discussing scientific things, but we don't have to look up the philosophy to look up philosophical concepts because philosophy's dead, so fuck it.
Yeah. And again, if people understood epistemic responsibility, then this sort of thing might change and the arguments might get better.
Yeah, you're probably right there. I hope you're right. I hope the arguments got better. I'm often quite embarrassed by some of the arguments that come out on the internet, but but to be honest, I probably made a bunch of them myself a few years back.
We all do. I do every day. You know what I mean? But I accept that I'm very rarely the smartest person in any room.
Oh, but that's probably because you know deep down that you probably are.
No, I'm definitely not. I'm just a little more informed than most people. I've still got a long way to go.
I think there is something to be said for assuming everyone's intelligent. Even if someone seems like an idiot, be charitable and assume they're intelligent. Assume that they're a good person, that they're a moral person, that they have good values, and have that conversation with them and try and find out for yourself. Especially on the internet, it's worldwide. There are some people speaking second, third, fourth language, and they might sound like they're an idiot, but could you speak their language in any way, shape, or form? No.
Exactly.
So actually, they could be really bright, but just haven't quite mastered English. Hell, most English people haven't mastered English.
That would be me.
Like the ray guns people.
But yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point. The principle of charity will help with understanding the principle of charity will help with something like epistemic responsibility because if you go into everything with like, oh, all Christians are irrational, you're not being very charitable.
No.
And you're automatically assuming that everything that they say is going to be wrong. Well, what happens if what they're saying actually disproves what you're saying?
Yeah. That's
I
essentially a
mean,
genetic fallacy, isn't it?
it is. There are certain people, like, I don't know if you've heard of a debater called Darth Dawkins.
I've heard of him, but not seen him or anything like that.
Yeah, he's mostly kind of dishonest. He likes to shout over people. He's the new Sci-10 Brugging Kate, basically.
Right. So he's the theistic version of Unirock.
Yeah. And there's good reason to not show somebody like that the principle of charity because they're not coming in with honest intentions. They're coming in with the intentions to berate and just argue and just be dismissive and put you down. There's no reason to show them the principle of charity. But the average Christian who's having a discussion with you probably honestly believes what they believe. And many of them probably have justifications for what they believe. So we should be having a discussion with them. If our discussions are stuck on something like, oh, well, the burden of proof lies on you, and then just going with, well, I just don't believe you, how are we going to ever change their mind? So showing them the principle of charity and going, well, okay, I believe the burden of proof is on you, but let's discuss your justifications. Let's discuss my justifications. Let's have a conversation about justifications. Then progress can be made.
Yeah, definitely. Josh says maybe instead of charity, the word should be respect. I think they're sort of intertwined in this
Yeah.
situation. Giving someone the charity is showing them respect. It's allowing them to speak. It's allowing them to justify their beliefs, explain them, and having a proper conversation with them rather than going, "Oh, you're just a theist. You're wrong." So they're basically the same thing. The principle of charity is what we should do, though. You could respect someone without necessarily assuming they're intelligent. But I would suggest that's why we should be charitable in every situation, at least our first interaction with someone anyway, and have them demonstrate, their beliefs, and if they are intelligent, etc. Just assume they are, and you might get disappointed, but at least you've gone in there with an open mind, and because of that, you will be respectful.
Yeah, there's a little more to it than that as well, though. It's not just being respectful. Um, it's the act of taking the most charitable interpretation of their argument. So if they make an argument, rather than take the worst reading possible of it, take the best, assume that they're smart, assume that they're rational, and go with that. Assume that their argument is the most rational rather than the most irrational argument.
So I suppose in that instance, you turn around, and if they've made a bit of a broken argument, but you think you get what they're saying, you can quite easily go back to them and try and present their own argument back to them in the best light possible. Essentially, steel manning.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Because by not applying that principle of charity to them and not attempting to give it the best reading, you're creating a straw man of some sense. You're going, well, they're a theist, they must be irrational, therefore their argument must be irrational, therefore I'll take the most irrational reading. You probably haven't interpreted their thing correctly.
Mm.
And you also haven't discharged your epistemic responsibility because you haven't aimed for the truth of what they were saying. You've aimed for an interpretation that you can easily attack.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, essentially building, as you say, the straw man rather than doing the steel man, which is what you should be doing. So, and that's why it's more than just respect, Josh. So hopefully that answers your question.
But respect is a big part of it.
Yes, it's
I mean,
not
Josh
just
is
respect.
right. Yeah, Josh is right. Respect is a huge part of it. And this goes back to something I'd mentioned a few times before, where if you don't gain that other person's respect, they're not going to listen to anything you say.
Yeah.
And if the purpose is to have a discussion about their justifications for their beliefs, you want them to listen to what you have to say.
Oh yeah. Especially if you're going to try and change their mind.
Exactly.
I wouldn't necessarily try and change anyone's mind in your first interaction with them unless they're doing something dangerous.
Yeah.
Because you need to build that rapport with someone. And I think that's, in some respects, I like to have the conversations with people, wherever it is, on whatever medium, where I find out about their beliefs. And I find more often than not, I tend to just listen and ask questions these days. Unless I notice a really big glaring hole that I'll go, what about this? But in general, I'll go, you know what, I probably could invalidate half of that, but realistically, let's have the conversation. I don't have to agree with you. It's nice that we're having the conversation. And it's why I think that, especially lately, a lot of the followers I've been getting have been from theists, and a lot of the conversations I'm having with people that have been good and fruitful and an enjoyable conversation have actually been with theists, because on the one hand they're surprised that someone's actually willing to listen to them, and on the other hand that it's because I am trying to be charitable, respectful, etc. And I'm not just telling them you're wrong, you're irrational, etc.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I mean, we have to ask ourselves, what's the purpose of, if we're looking into changing the way people see belief in God and changing the way they see belief in general and justifications for belief, how are we ever going to do that if we don't actually have these conversations with them?
Yeah, I don't know. I've just been distracted by a random comment. Have you seen that one pop up?
No, I can't see the comments.
Okay. So Brendan Davidson has chimed in. Oh, I need to get the chat room up. It's gone off of that screen. It says, "Excuse me, does anyone have a bag of almonds? I need to find my cake I'm baking. Thanks in advance." Like, what?
Okay.
Yeah, completely threw me off.
I think that's the point.
Well done.
What's the guy in The Boys? The Black Noir. Ask him for the almonds.
God, I'd be scared to ask him for anything.
Well, he's not a fan of almonds, is he? Because he's got the nut allergy.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
completely forgot about that. Yeah. Oh, well
Not
remembered.
meaning to spoil anything, you know.
Well, you didn't say what happens with the nut allergy. You just mentioned he has one. So
Yeah, exactly. I should probably pay more attention to the comments.
No, it's fine. I've got my eyes on it.
Okay.
It's good though, because I mean, because we're multi-streaming and stuff like that, it's coming in from all different areas. The only problem is, even though the messages come in from Facebook as well, they don't send back to Facebook, so they'll send to Twitter and Twitter maybe. Twitch is what I meant to say though. YouTube and I don't know. Oh, Discord. So all of those places where they come in, I send them back. But yeah. Yeah, it does go to Twitter on Periscope as well. So yeah. Thank you very much, Brendan, for the random diversion.
It makes our stream last that little bit longer and be that little bit funnier, so it's all good.
Yeah, it's entertained me. But where were we, Dave?
We were talking about
Epistemic
something.
Justification.
Yeah. Well, that's another part of epistemic responsibility, obviously, and that it's an important part, because this is where all those people who go, well, I don't have a burden of proof, I'm not making a claim, you still have a burden to justify, and it shouldn't really even be called a burden, because that makes it sound like hard work. But you should still have the duty of epistemic justification to yourself, especially if you want to claim to be epistemically responsible, which is what you're basically doing when you claim to be a skeptic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole not having a burden of proof thing that is very common in atheists. I think it's on the one hand, it is the way it's named, in the same way like the Big Bang's quite an accurate descriptor for the Big Bang. Burden, it's not really a burden. It's it can be quite easy. A lot of beliefs. I mean, I could justify to you right now quite easily that this is wine in this glass. Yeah,
Or is it just a random collection of bytes on a computer that a guy with a brain in a vat is running?
No more brain in vat. My mind will explode.
But yeah, no, it's true. I mean, you could say, look, I poured the wine.
Yeah.
I had the bottle. I tasted it. It's got me a little bit pissed. I can justify that it's wine in that glass.
And if I really wanted to, I could go one step further and go downstairs, grab you the bottle, because there's a little bit left, and finish this off and pour a bit in. And you can see it was the same color, and that's going up to verification.
Yeah.
Now, I couldn't necessarily prove without a doubt that it was wine that was in that bottle. It could just be a red liquid, but realistically speaking, why am I going to be making this lie? So therefore, I'm not going to gain anything from this lie. So that's another part of your justification, your reasoning. He gains nothing from telling me that that's in. There's no reason to lie. So right, okay. But that's the other side of it as well. The word proof. It sounds like it has to be something that is completely conclusive and prove that it's absolutely true. But again, that is wrong, especially when it comes to a belief or a lack of belief in something. It's, well, these are the reasons that I do or don't believe this thing. That's pretty much it. Like you could be backed by evidence and things like that, but generally, just having a good thought process can count for a lot of the justification, and that's what it is really. I and I
Yeah,
don't. Sorry, Karen. Dave.
sorry. No. I was just going to say it's exactly what you said. All it is to show that you have thought about this thing. You have thought about this stance. You have good reason to hold this belief. It you don't even have to be absolutely certain. You don't even have to show that it's absolutely true. You just have to show that you have good reasons to think these things. And I think a lot of atheists, like you said, when they hear this thing, um, I believe God doesn't exist. Well, then you have to prove God doesn't exist. Well, no. You just have to show that you have good reasons to believe that it's probable that he doesn't exist. Not show without a doubt. Just show that you have more reasons to believe that God does not exist than God does exist.
Yeah, I mean there is. It's that difference, isn't it, between a claim and a belief. Now, you could say a belief is a form of claim, but what you're doing when you're making a claim is you're making a statement about your external reality, right? Like I did when I told you that there was wine in this glass and there's only a little dribble left. That was a claim, right? That was me telling you something that I think is true, and I can still justify that. But if I'm saying I believe something, so let's just say Dave was to turn round and say, I believe that that was wine in Joe's glass. We're not going to get into knowledge. We're just going to say, I believe that was wine. That is an internal claim. It's him saying, yes, I agree that this is probably, I've got a positive attitude towards this proposition of that there was wine in that glass. And all he has to do is justify that. And Dave and I know each other quite well, so he's got enough justification to just believe a tiny claim like that just because I said it. Now
Yeah,
if you
if you
sorry,
told me it was liquid mercury, I might not be able to rationally justify
yeah, you'd be wondering why I've got so much hair.
that. But you're absolutely right. When it comes to beliefs, it's more about justifying that you have good reason to hold those mental states, basically.
Yeah. So Ozzy has actually just chimed in. He said the word proof has many epistemic uses, and among them is a cognate term for evidence and a reason, a rationale, and justification. And you're right. I just think that it's one of those words that sounds scary from the outset. When people hear proof, they think purely of this is almost in the mathematical way. This is conclusive that this is this, and that's one of the big fears people have about the burden of proof. They think that I have to prove this true without a doubt.
Yeah, I think part of that might come from, I mean, I'm only hedging a bit here, but I think part of it might come from this whole idea that everything should be talked about in terms of science. So the idea of proving something is the idea of showing good evidence, showing a theory, and all that kind of stuff. But it's not necessarily that case. You have to start thinking outside of the bounds of something scientism like.
Yeah, and I suppose even then, science doesn't really ever. I suppose it can, but doesn't really prove things are true without a doubt. It basically operates on. It seems like this is the most likely truth, doesn't it? It's not. It's that whole fallibilism, falsification. It hasn't been shown that it's false, so it can be considered true for now. It works with all the theories and testings and everything like that, all the predictions we make off of it. Everything about this theory currently seems right. So even then, within science, they're not proving it true in the way that they are perceiving the word proof to be. And as Ozzy says, proof isn't always to be restricted to a guarantee of veracity. And he's
Exactly.
right. But it's just people's perception of the word. like we were talking about perception of the word belief. It's all these things. People have these ideas that this is what these words mean, and it's been verified by all the other people that use these words, and therefore we're stuck in this box. And someone's saying, no, that's not what that word means. Well, they're clearly wrong, because all the other atheists I speak to say that's what it is.
Yeah. And I think that's why more atheists kind of need to get out of these echo chambers like the Atheist Republic. They need, yeah, they need to step outside and actually start having conversations, not starting from this idea that they know it all, but starting from the idea of, like the skeptic that they claim to be, that they could be wrong about everything.
Which is hard and a lot of work.
Oh yeah, it is. I mean, that's taking it a step too far, obviously. And I'm just using a bit of rhetoric, being a bit hyperbolic. But when you go into a conversation with somebody else and they say, well, maybe you're not using that word quite right, it might be time to just pause for a moment and think, okay, maybe I am stuck in a kind of feedback loop for myself and stuck in an echo chamber. And all these reinforcements that have come from other people mean that I should kind of be a little bit honest here and say, well, maybe I'm not correct.
And perhaps not just checking what the Google dictionary says it is,
Yeah.
because it's an internet dictionary, so it's going to give you the most commonly used definition on the internet. So if you're in an echo chamber of how it's defined on the internet, you're only going to find out how it's defined on the internet using that dictionary. And remember, dictionaries are descriptive. They describe how it's used. So if you were to actually go for an English dictionary versus an American dictionary versus an internet dictionary versus, say, a French dictionary or something like that, you'd get a different definition or a selection of different definitions, with the most commonly one used in that area probably at the top. That's why the word atheist or atheism will be defined differently in, say, the Cambridge Dictionary to how it is in the Google Dictionary. And there is more to terminology than dictionaries as well. But I'd always check a few different dictionaries for a definition. If someone ever goes, well, there's other definitions to that. It's a polysemous word. There's a number of different definitions. Go and have a look and go, oh yeah, there are. So maybe there's a bit of context that matters. And then go, well, what subject am I discussing? And if you're having a scientific conversation, then look up some scientific literature and find out how that term is used. For example, theory. There is a normative use for theory within science. Whereas if you're talking about belief, we're back to philosophy again. So there is a normative use for how belief is used within philosophy.
Or psychology.
Yeah. So yeah, it's one of those things. Even with those semantic arguments that happen where people say it only means this, it doesn't, because I can show you 4 dictionaries right now that show that it's different. No, only one of those is right. Oh, really? That's one of
Yeah.
the most frustrating ones where people talk about a wrong definition. I mean, context aside, there is no real wrong definition.
There's some better than others, depending on what you're using. And I think accepting these kind of epistemic responsibilities and epistemic duties and understanding justifications would actually help atheists to argue against the believer better. Because simply going, well, I've just got a lack of belief, I'm just discussing a psychological state, you're not really showing that you have good reasons. You might say, well, I have good reasons to not accept the claim because you haven't fulfilled your burden of proof. Well, you've still got to explain why they haven't fulfilled that burden to you. So why not just skip all that and go with, well, let's just have a look at your justifications. These are the justifications that I use for not believing you. Just skip all the foreplay, for want of a better word, and go straight to having that discussion. Put that pressure on their beliefs. And you can only do that by actually discussing their beliefs and discussing why you don't believe them.
Yeah, fair. So Ozzy's come in and said, yeah. Sorry, before that, Josh said, yeah, you don't have to run the liquid in your glass through a mass spectrometer. Yeah, you're right. There
Yeah.
is enough justification to accept that claim. I wouldn't necessarily suggest anyone who doesn't know me just go, oh, well, he said it, so it must be true. Have a little think about it, as I was explaining about, well, why would I lie about that sort of thing, etc. And yeah, Ozzy goes, yeah, groupthink among people in the atheist movement is one of the most disheartening and disappointing facts about the movement. Josh goes, do you think it has anything to do with them being afraid they might be convinced back into religion? So Ozzy goes, no, I think it's primarily intellectual laziness at work. Interesting. I think in some respects, both could be valid statements. I think, especially when you first leave religion, you can be quite hurt by it, quite angry at religion, quite anti the religion. So, and people telling you these arguments to try and bring you back in, it could cause you to be really, really anti. Not that you feel like you're going to be pulled back into it exactly, but I've had enough of this shit. So you just try and distance yourself from it. But intellectual laziness, I would say, is definitely, definitely a big thing in people in general, not just the atheist community. I think we can all be intellectually lazy in certain bits, especially if we have, say, a friend that we might trust more on things. We might defer to their opinion on things that we can't quite be bothered to look into ourselves. So what happens is you end up having people elevated to leaders. So you've got people like Ra, etc., who have been elevated to this status, and you have people who just look to them and, as we said, intellectually lazy. They go, oh well, he said it, so it must be true because he's a smart rational atheist, and so I'll just take his word for it. They haven't used any logical reasoning. They haven't verified anything. They have not met their epistemic responsibility.
And also, people like AiR and Raw haven't discharged part of their responsibility by making sure that rather than putting across a narrative, they're putting across facts and showing people everything and showing them how to think. Not just what to think, but how to think.
Yeah. Yeah. If we're not careful, we're going to get back onto the whole rock thing, though. So.
No, let's yeah, so part of epistemic responsibility is being responsible with your knowledge and how you transmit it as well. And things like that. And like it can stop intellectual laziness. By explaining to people that they have to be rigorous, they have to be thoughtful. They just being atheist doesn't make you smart. It doesn't make you rational. If it did, I would be smart and rational.
Yeah, and I think it's quite unfortunate that there are those studies that show atheists tend to be more intelligent than theists. But what that doesn't take into account is the locations they're in, the schooling, etc. Poorer people tend to be more religious because they have less, and they're more emotionally entwined into that religious community. And if they didn't have that religious community, they wouldn't have the support that they have, etc., etc., etc. It's not exactly a fair statement on one's intelligence.
No.
So there's so many different factors that go into this, and I suppose, realistically speaking, if we're speaking of epistemic responsibility, if we're going to have a conversation about a particular topic, we do have that responsibility to try and learn as much about that topic as we can. If someone points out something we don't know, take a step back and have a think about it, and really only pass on stuff that we do and we have verified and can justify as to why. So it's all these scientists, etc., getting involved in philosophy, saying it's dead, saying etc., etc. It it's sort of, they're not fulfilling their burden there, really, are they? They're not being responsible. They don't know enough about the topic that they are speaking of to actually say it with any authority. But because they are an authority, or are seen as an authority by atheists, it's instantly accepted. So there is an almost triangle of, the responsibility falling down.
Yeah.
So how do we address that?
By speaking to other atheists and hoping that they actually listen.
Uh, See, I've found that to be more difficult than talking to theists of late. I've been called a theist troll so many times.
Yeah, and it goes back to something Ozzy said last week, where you can say something in an atheist group and you will just be dogpiled by people who all think the same thing and all think you're wrong. And even though you show that you might be actually knowledgeable in this topic, because you're saying something other than what everybody else is saying, they just assume you're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder how we can break that. I mean, that's just human tribal nature, really, isn't it? We're very, very, very guilty of that as people. In fact, all species are, you group with things that are like you, and you're afraid of things that are not. That's
Yeah.
how species survived. Um,
I also think there's a big thing in the atheist community now where it's a sort of aesthetic skepticism, aesthetic atheism, where it's about looking like you're smart, looking like you're rational, looking like you're a critical thinker, but not actually doing the work because looking like it is enough. There's enough people that are aesthetic skeptics and aesthetic atheists where you can actually feel part of that group anyway.
mm, yeah, almost like it's a badge of honor in the
Yeah,
same way, as you mentioned, the skeptics. I'm a skeptic. I'm an atheist. I'm super smart and rational.
yeah,
Rather than actually being any of those things. Yeah, I suppose with any group, anywhere, you end up going through the whole lowest common denominator thing, don't you? And they always tend to be the loudest. Um, and that's one of the reasons I think that atheists often have a bad name. It's because of the worst members. In the same way that theists often get thought of as irrational, because it's often the YECs, for example, bringing them back into it again, who are the loudest and the most, getting on everyone's case and how they're all going to hell, etc., etc. You could see it the same with vegans, for example. There's plenty of good arguments for veganism, but the ones you always see are the really loud, obnoxious, holier than thou, um, all that sort of stuff, storming restaurants that serve meat, etc., covering people in pig blood. And you're just like, well, it makes you think, well, why would I want to be part of that? But people can't see that often within their own group. And I sometimes I'm an onlooker to conversations between theists and atheists, and they're both behaving this way, but they're both seeing themselves as right in that situation, the other person as wrong and irrational. And it's like you're both doing the same thing. You're both treating each other as badly as the other one. That's the reason no one's listening to anyone. You're basically just flinging poo at each other and hoping some of it sticks. It's
yeah.
not gonna work.
It really isn't. And I, I think over the last 10 years or so, because atheists have become more and more involved in this, ridiculous beliefs deserve ridicule. And that's my stance. And that's how I'm going to treat theists. I'm going to treat them all as irrational. I'm going to mock them all until they fall in line. Theists have sort of dug their heels in more and more and become like that. But there are actual decent conversations out there being held. They're just few and far between. And it would be nice if that expanded, because maybe if atheists actually started having more pressing conversations with the theist, then they might be more open to actually listening, and we might actually make progress in actually countering some of those arguments.
Mm. back to the whole respect and charity thing again, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with being a vocal atheist. I was growing up. I used to argue with people about how I didn't believe in God because, as you know, I've never been religious. I've always been atheist. So even as a teenager, I had these discussions, and people were willing to listen, and I could be vocal. I suppose growing up in the UK it was slightly different
Mm.
because we're less fanatical about it, I suppose. So it was easier for me. But you can still be vocal without yelling at people.
Oh, definitely. It's the way you do it, isn't it? It's
Exactly.
your execution is what really matters. And it's yeah. I suppose though that's the other thing. A lot of the vocal atheists that are bad with it do come from more religious areas that have had incredibly bad experiences with religion. And growing up in the UK like you, when I started doubting and looking into things and everything like that, I mean, I grew up going to Christian schools, but there wasn't that whole anti, like, oh no, oh no, you must believe in God. No, there isn't that going on. Whereas I remember when I lived in America, um, I was 13 at the time, and I was having this conversation with Yusuf, and he was so anti me not believing in anything, and by that obviously any god. He said, "I have to have a religion. You have to believe in something. It's good to believe in something, whatever it is." Um, so I ended up going, "Yeah, I'm a Wiccan," because being a witch apparently is better than being an atheist. I didn't know much about Islam at the time. I sort of understand where he was coming from, but I think either way, if we were in an incredibly fundamentalist part, I'd have been killed.
Yeah. And see, this is why religions need to be challenged as well because of things like that.
Mm,
And the only way you're going to be able to challenge those kind of stereotypes is to actually have conversations with people and show them why those stereotypes are wrong.
mm.
If they have this stereotype that all atheists, all they want to do is mock people and have no morals, and they're confronted with 100 people that are just mocking them and laughing at them and picking on them and bullying them and trying to make them conform, they're not really going to listen.
No, and that will be what they believe the case is. Yeah, and through no fault of their own, I guess they'll tar everyone with the same brush.
Yeah, because that's generally the way humans work. They make these wide sweeping generalizations.
We are pattern recognizing machines, really.
Yeah.
And if you have this, you get told this, and then you see it all happening, and there might have been one down here that was rational, but it was lost in the sea of all of those people being mocking and horrible. You suddenly go, oh yeah, well they pretty much all are, aren't they? So what's the point? I'm just going to treat them all like they're horrible people.
Yeah. And if we can start breaking these stereotypes and start getting them to listen, we can start breaking other stereotypes.
Yeah. It's going to be a long, slow process, and we need all atheists to get on board with it, really. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of the types of atheists that we're talking about tonight who have an issue with things like the burden of proof, and any form of epistemic responsibility, and they believe that they should be ridiculing theists, etc. They're probably not going to be even watching this video, and if they are, they're probably sitting there going, "Fucking wankers."
Yeah.
um, a couple of messages from the chat I missed. So Ozzy says, so he's talking about what you were talking earlier. You're describing what he likes to call performative skepticism, the mere outward pretense of having critical thinking skills. So it's like you were saying, aesthetic skepticism. Yeah.
Performative is a much better word. Yeah.
Okay, we're stealing that, Ozzy. um Adam, sorry, your comment. I think I've gone too far in the conversation. He goes, marginal case or name the trait argument for veganism is quite difficult to get out of. Do you know what I was talking about at that point?
Probably about vegans, and it was when we were discussing about how everybody notices the loudest ones.
Yeah, the holier than thou attitude that you can get, and it's not just vegans that do it. They're just bringing that back, just in case that seemed like I was slamming vegans. Most vegans, um, you don't hear from. It's just those that usually are new to it, and they're very loud, very holier than thou. Do you know what that sounds like? A lot of atheists who have left their religion in the last year or two, and they're being really loud and they're being really holier than thou, and oh, your God's immoral and rah rah rah. It's the same sort of thing. So that's what I was trying to do there, was just try and make people more aware that this whole groupthink and attitude and aggression, and just draw a line between other groups that you might look at and go, God, I don't want to be like them. Have a look at your own group, because your own group could be just the same. And it's one of the things that I actually struggle with the atheist community online. And it's probably one of the reasons that I do quite often get called a theist troll or something like that, because I'm trying to have conversations with them to try and break down the barriers that they have for theism and stuff like that, and trying to explain epistemic justification. And they're not receptive to it because they're stuck in that groupthink.
Yeah, think a lot of atheists like to play name that fallacy or fallacy bingo.
Yeah.
Here's something that might be worth them considering is that if they believe something simply because everybody else in their echo chamber believes it, they're probably suffering from a bandwagon fallacy.
Yeah. Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, I suppose we're all guilty of that. Generally, you can understand why people might make that sort of fallacy, because uh swings and roundabouts, really, though, isn't it, Dave? There are times when it is good to go with a consensus, but I generally say the consensus should be people who are professionals in what they're speaking of, not just the people around you, not just because your mates are doing it, but actually the leading experts in their field all say X about their field, not about some other topic, about their field. At that point, I think you're probably justified in accepting what they say a little bit more than, well, all my mates say that we should do this, so that's what we're going to do, right?
I and well, that's another thing you could say about skepticism. You generally find a lot of skeptics who don't really have a lot of knowledge in a particular topic, who, to play the part of a skeptic, will say, "Oh well, no, I don't believe that," and they'll say that about something that somebody who has years of study and research and just like an immense amount of knowledge about a particular topic, they'll say, "Well, no, I think you're wrong."
Yeah.
And that's not, I mean, if you're not convinced, that's fair enough, but you should be more suspending your judgment rather than turning around and saying, I know this will be a bit of a harm to Jesus mythicists, because they're basically going, well, these two people said something. And that goes against all the consensus, but it conforms to what I want to be true. Chances are, if you're swayed by Jesus mythicism, you should probably be suspending judgment rather than saying, well, Jesus' mythicism is correct, simply because these one or two people say it.
Yeah. And adding claims to that, I actually read something on the American Atheist site the other day that actually made a couple of erroneous claims, saying that the burden of proof is only on the claimant. And I was like, oh, really? Stop selling out these like false informations. But then it was actually going on about how most scholars uh, accept that Jesus didn't actually exist. And it was like, what? That is incredibly false. The general consensus, regardless of theological position, is that Yeshua, the man, existed as an apocalyptic preacher. We're not talking about we're not talking about the biblical Jesus here. We're talking about the character it was based on. There was probably that person. Now, nothing in it is definitive, but these fringe cases, these fringe theories, come out because they're popular in the atheist community. Ha! Well, if Jesus never existed, therefore Bible is irrelevant because Christianity's based on something false. Now, there's a lot of better arguments. And I suppose we shouldn't really get into these too deeply now. They can watch the History for Atheists show, and we can come to some other arguments for atheism and against various religions in future streams if anyone's interested in that. But yeah, it's going again with what we atheists and skeptics always accuse like fundamentalists of doing, is starting with their conclusion and working their way back. We do it too, and I suppose the fact that everybody does it shows that it is a natural behavior. But a good skeptic would be fighting against that natural behavior. You might have the, well, I think this is the case in your head, and you're fine to, but try and apply a layer of epistemic agnosticism until you've fully looked into it, and don't just believe sites that have an agenda. Sites like the American Atheists are doing what they do for political reasons. They have an agenda. They're arguing ideologically. So you'd be more justified in suspending judgment in what they say until you've had a chance to actually verify it from credible sources, rather than just assuming because they've said it, it's credible. Again, that's back to your epistemic responsibility, isn't it? Don't just believe us. I've even put it on our blog in our about page. Don't just take everything that we say as read. I jump in, and we put references in a lot of the articles, not all of them. But there are often, especially Dave's articles, very well referenced. But if we're talking about something like belief, load a SEP article on belief or an IEP article on belief and have a long old read about those from a couple of different sources and see what they say. And actually read the detail rather than just a one-line definition from, the online dictionary.
Yeah.
That is your responsibility. Sorry, Dave.
That's all right. Speaking of references, if anybody wants to read a good paper on epistemic responsibility, it's quite short, but covers the topics quite well, and it's very easy to read. And hang on, I better actually load it up.
I'll put it in the notes as well for anyone that's watching this.
It's called Epistemic Responsibility by J. Angelo Corlett. It's in the International Journal of Philosophical Studies. It's 21 pages, and it's from 2008. And we'll put a link in, but that's an excellent paper to introduce you to this idea.
Awesome. And actually, I suggest anyone who is still going on about burden of proofs only on the claimant, just check the IEP article on epistemic justification as well, which is part of the responsibility, but it might be a bit more of an entry into it. Read that and then read more on the overall thing. We've also got a few articles on the site, like Do We Atheists Have a Burden of Proof? More on beliefs, claims, and justifications. Trying to think of the other ones we got on there. I've got Burden of Proof, Belief versus Claim, Court Case Analogy, or something like that. So we'll put in links to all of those. Obviously, when our articles on the site are probably a little bit more simplistic than the philosophical stuff. But again, it could be a way
more simplistic.
Yeah, I definitely am.
As am I.
But it could be a good way to understand some of the basics of the topic and build your knowledge up. So have a quick read of a few of those articles on Answers in Reason, then jump up to the IEP article on epistemic justification, then read that article that you suggested on epistemic responsibility. So I'll include all of those links in the show notes. If I don't get to it tonight, I'll do it tomorrow. And when I post it on Answers in Reason, I'll also include them there as well.
And I'm about halfway through an article kind of summarizing all this stuff that we've said here tonight.
Oh, awesome. I can't wait to read that. Is this where I
Yeah,
find out everything I've been saying tonight's completely wrong?
I tend to release an article and then find out everything I said was completely wrong. That's why we need more Aussies and more Opies.
Yes. Come and correct us. Is there anything else you think we need to cover tonight, though, Dave?
No, I think we've given a pretty good example of the basic ideas of these things and sort of given a way for people to start thinking about these things and start understanding these things and start looking into these things and maybe think about their own behavior and their own sort of self-assessments.
Yeah. And it's something that I think everybody needs to take on board and practice and practice and practice and not become complacent in it. I think one of the problems that a lot of us have, a lot of atheists might come to be atheists through being skeptics, and they get there through very rational means, and then they stop.
Yeah.
And they've just assumed, I am now here, I am a rational skeptic. They forget to keep on being a skeptic. And that comes back to the responsibility again, doesn't it? It's you've got to continue, and it might become more and more second nature. You might find yourself questioning yourself more and more, and it might become a bit of a headache. But if being rational, if the truth and all of those things are important to you, then that's part of your responsibility. And if you're not interested in being rational and holding truth, why are you having these conversations?
Yeah. Step out of the way and let people who actually want to have these conversations have the conversations. Stop flooding the conversations with memes and insults and let the grown-ups talk.
I best stop talking.
Yeah, same. I'm like 12, you know. IQ, anyway.
So on that note, I guess we'll finish for the night. Hopefully everybody had a good time. Thank you everyone for joining in. Ozzy, yes, we'd love to have you in either Discord or back on a stream again anytime. Anything you want to discuss. Really enjoyed it last time, and we've had some great responses on it so far across the web. So yes, we'd definitely love to have you back.
Yeah.
And if any of our other audience have a topic that they'd like to discuss with us as well, just contact us either on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or anywhere. We're happy to have these conversations. We're looking for discussions. We're not looking for debate. You can have a different opinion to us. That's fine. But we find debate tends to be a lot of that, and we'd like a lot of that.
Yeah.
if that makes sense to anyone out there, it did to my head.
And as you can see, we're jovial people.
Yeah, at least I think we are.
No, I'm psycho.
Yeah, I like that picture of you with a knife.
Yeah.
You look proper evil in that. Anyway. Yeah, I've had a good time tonight. Thank you for that, Dave. And thank you for everyone listening in. Have yourselves a good night. You've been listening to the SciPhi show from the folks that brought you fresh air. I'm Joe.
And I'm actually Dave.
Good night, all.
Good night, all. Good night, Ozzy. Good night, Opie. Good night, Josh.